The quietest basketball court is often the loudest warning that something is wrong. The first thing I noticed wasn't the empty court. It was the silence. Every weekday, around 5 in the afternoon, the basketball court at the center of our neighborhood came alive. The rhythmic bounce of basketballs echoed between rows of maple trees. Sneakers squeaked against the painted asphalt. Parents chatted on nearby benches while younger siblings chased each other across the grass. It wasn't just a place to play. It was where friendships started, neighbors met for the first time, and kids learned lessons that had nothing to do with winning a game. That Thursday, all of it was gone. No laughter. No bouncing basketballs. No teenagers calling for passes. Only a warm breeze pushing a loose sheet of paper against the chain-link fence. As I walked closer, I saw the new notice attached to the entrance. Temporary court closure pending HOA safety review. 3 children stood outside the locked gate, each holding a basketball. One boy bounced his ball exactly once before catching it with both hands. Another stared through the fence as if he expected someone to unlock it at any moment. The youngest girl quietly asked her older brother if they could come back tomorrow. He didn't answer. Neither could I. My name is Daniel Carter, and I had lived in Willow Creek Estates for nearly 12 years. I had watched this neighborhood grow from newly planted trees into a community filled with families who knew each other's names. I'd attended countless HOA meetings, volunteered during neighborhood cleanups, and believed that most disagreements could be solved with patience and honest conversation. But that handwritten silence hanging on the fence felt different. As I turned away, I noticed Patricia Collins walking across the parking lot toward the clubhouse. She carried a neatly organized folder under one arm and greeted another board member with a satisfied smile. Her posture was composed, confident, almost relieved. She didn't glance toward the children waiting outside the locked gate. At that moment, I didn't know whether she had personally requested the closure or simply supported it. I only knew the timing wasn't a coincidence. Later that evening, my phone buzzed with an HOA email. The subject line read, Community Recreation Area Safety Evaluation. The message explained that recent concerns about excessive noise, liability, and property values required immediate action. Until further review, access to the basketball court would remain suspended. There were no statistics, no incident reports, no explanation of who had raised the concerns. Just carefully chosen words that sounded official enough to discourage questions. I read the email twice before setting my phone down. Something about it didn't sit right. Outside my kitchen window, I could still see the empty court in the fading sunlight. The freshly painted three-point line reflected the orange glow of sunset, untouched by footprints. A basketball someone had forgotten earlier rested against the fence, perfectly still. For years, people had described our neighborhood as peaceful. That evening, it wasn't peaceful. It felt unfinished. As darkness settled over Willow Creek Estates, porch lights flickered on one by one. Families gathered inside for dinner, but conversations throughout the neighborhood revolved around the same unexpected question. Why would anyone close the one place where the kids always felt welcome? I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But standing there in the quiet, watching that abandoned court disappear into the night, I made a promise to myself. Before anyone decided the future of that court, I was going to find out exactly how this decision had been made, and whether the neighborhood had ever truly been asked what it wanted. The next morning, I decided I wasn't looking for someone to blame. I was looking for the first piece of the truth. The clubhouse always smelled faintly of fresh coffee and old paper. It was a familiar place where holiday decorating committees, landscaping discussions, and annual budget meetings usually unfolded without much excitement. That Friday morning, it felt unusually quiet. The receptionist recognized me immediately and smiled as I asked whether homeowners could review community records related to recent board decisions. She nodded without hesitation, as long as they're available for member inspection. That sentence told me something important before I even opened a single folder. If the decision to close the basketball court had followed the normal process, there would be a paper trail. I signed the visitor log and settled into a small conference room overlooking the neighborhood pond. Sunlight reflected across the water while ducks drifted lazily between patches of reeds. It was difficult to believe that only a few hundred yards away, children had been turned away from their favorite place to play. A stack of meeting minutes soon arrived beside me. I started with the most recent board meeting: landscaping, pool maintenance, insurance renewal, holiday lighting. Routine expenses. Nothing unusual. Then I reached a short paragraph near the end of the document. Community recreational facilities discussed under homeowner concerns. No names. No detailed discussion. No recorded vote. Just a single sentence followed by further evaluation recommended. I frowned. For a decision that had resulted in locking an entire basketball court, the official record felt surprisingly incomplete. Next came maintenance reports. The basketball court had received fresh paint less than a year earlier. The fencing had passed inspection. The lighting system had recently been upgraded. Repair costs were minimal compared to several other neighborhood amenities. Nothing suggested an urgent safety emergency. If anything, the reports described one of the best-maintained recreational spaces in Willow Creek Estates. I continued reading until I found the annual budget. Recreation expenses represented only a small portion of HOA spending. Landscaping projects cost significantly more. Decorative entrance improvements exceeded several years of basketball court maintenance combined. Again, the numbers didn't support the explanation in the email. Outside the conference room window, I noticed Patricia Collins crossing the courtyard with two board members. She carried the same organized folder I had seen the previous afternoon. They spoke quietly before disappearing into another office. None of them looked toward the court. I wasn't interested in guessing what their conversation involved. Facts mattered more than assumptions. Before leaving, I requested copies of the publicly available meeting minutes and financial summaries. The receptionist printed everything without hesitation. If you have questions, she said politely, the next HOA meeting is open to homeowners. I thanked her and carried the documents home inside a plain manila folder. That afternoon, I spread every page across my dining room table. Meeting minutes beside budget reports. Maintenance inspections beside recreation expenses. The more I organized everything, the clearer one pattern became. I still hadn't found evidence explaining why the basketball court needed to close immediately. What I had found instead was something equally important. There were unanswered questions. As evening settled over the neighborhood, I walked past the silent court once again. The chain-link fence cast long shadows across the empty asphalt. A faded free-throw line stretched toward two motionless hoops waiting for players who never arrived. Across the street, several parents stood together watching their children ride bicycles instead. They exchanged uncertain glances every time someone looked toward the locked gate. No one seemed angry. Mostly, they seemed confused. Standing there, I realized this story was becoming much larger than one basketball court. If the decision truly reflected what the neighborhood wanted, the records would eventually show it. If they didn't, then the people who actually lived here deserved the opportunity to understand exactly how that decision had been made. By Saturday morning, I had stopped looking at documents and started looking at people. Paper could explain procedures. Neighbors could explain reality. I poured a cup of coffee into a travel mug, slipped the copied HOA records into my backpack, and began walking through Willow Creek Estates without any real plan except to listen. The sidewalks were already busy. Lawns were being mowed, dogs pulled gently on their leashes, and sprinklers clicked rhythmically across front yards. Everything looked normal until you reached the basketball court. Everyone noticed it. No one ignored the locked gate. The first conversation happened almost by accident. A father was helping his son inflate a basketball in the driveway. "We've been driving to another park," he told me after I introduced myself. "It's 20 minutes away." His son quietly spun the ball on one finger before it slipped to the concrete. "He keeps asking when ours will reopen." I admitted that I didn't know, but I'm trying to find out. He nodded. "If you ever ask homeowners what they think, count us in." Those words stayed with me as I continued walking. Every few houses, another conversation unfolded naturally. A retired couple remembered watching neighborhood tournaments every summer. A grandmother smiled while describing how the court gave her grandchildren something to do whenever they visited. A high school student explained that the court was where he met friends after finishing homework instead of staying inside all evening. None of them spoke with anger. They spoke with disappointment. More importantly, almost everyone asked me the same question. When did they decide this? I realized something surprising. Many residents knew the court had been closed. Very few knew how the decision had happened. By lunchtime, my notebook contained more names than I expected. I wasn't collecting signatures. I wasn't asking anyone to oppose the board. I simply wrote down their experiences, their concerns, and whether they had attended recent HOA meetings. A pattern slowly appeared. Most families had never received any direct request for feedback before the closure. That afternoon, I stopped near the community picnic pavilion where several parents had gathered while younger children played on the nearby grass. Without the basketball court, the open field had become the neighborhood's temporary meeting place. One mother suggested creating an online survey. Not to argue, she said, just to understand what people actually want. Everyone agreed immediately. The idea was refreshingly simple. Ask every homeowner the same respectful questions. Should the basketball court remain closed? If not, what improvements would make it better? Would you volunteer if upgrades were needed? No loaded language. No accusations. Just honest participation. I spent the rest of the afternoon building the survey and printing small cards with a QR code that linked directly to it. By evening, several neighbors had already volunteered to help distribute them during weekend walks. The energy throughout the community began to shift. People weren't talking about winning an argument anymore. They were talking about finally having a voice. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, I walked back toward the court one more time. Golden light filtered through the chain-link fence, casting long diamond-shaped shadows across the silent asphalt. A gentle breeze rolled an abandoned basketball from one side of the court to the other until it softly tapped the locked gate. The sound echoed through the empty space. It wasn't loud, but after listening to dozens of neighbors that day, it carried a completely different meaning. The court wasn't just missing players. It was missing the community that had always gathered around it. For the first time since the closure, I felt something stronger than frustration. I felt momentum. Whatever happened next wouldn't depend on one opinion. It would depend on whether an entire neighborhood finally had the opportunity to be heard. By Monday evening, the conversation had changed. No one was asking whether the basketball court mattered anymore. They were asking why no one had been asked before it was closed. When I opened the online survey after work, the first responses had already begun to appear. I expected a handful. Instead, there were dozens. Parents, retirees, young professionals, longtime homeowners. Even residents who admitted they had never used the basketball court themselves wrote thoughtful comments about preserving shared spaces for future families. I didn't edit a single response. I simply organized them exactly as they were submitted. As more answers arrived throughout the evening, one pattern became impossible to ignore. People weren't demanding conflict. They were asking for communication. The following morning, another HOA email appeared in my inbox. The subject line sounded reassuring. Community Recreation Update. I read every word carefully. The message repeated familiar concerns about noise, liability, and maintaining neighborhood standards. It explained that the temporary closure remained the most responsible course while the board evaluated possible long-term options. Again, there were no statistics, no maintenance reports, no survey results, no mention that dozens of homeowners were already participating in an independent community questionnaire. The email wasn't hostile. It simply presented conclusions without showing how those conclusions had been reached. I resisted every temptation to write an emotional reply. Instead, I opened my laptop and prepared something much simpler. A one-page summary. At the top, I wrote 3 short questions. How many residents have been asked for input? What documented safety issue requires immediate closure? What alternatives were considered before restricting access? Below those questions, I added publicly available information from the maintenance reports, financial summaries, and HOA meeting minutes. Everything was properly labeled. Every figure listed its source. No opinions. Only verifiable facts. That afternoon, several neighbors gathered at my dining room table. Coffee mugs slowly cooled while survey responses continued arriving every few minutes. One father quietly looked around the room. I thought I was the only one concerned. A grandmother smiled. I think most of us assumed everyone else agreed with the closure. Another neighbor shook his head. Maybe we've all been making assumptions. That sentence lingered in the room. It reminded us why we had started this process in the first place. Not to prove someone wrong. To discover what the neighborhood actually believed. By Wednesday evening, the survey had reached hundreds of households through simple conversations, neighborhood walks, and community message boards. Volunteers distributed printed cards with QR codes to anyone who preferred responding later. Participation continued growing. More importantly, the comments remained remarkably respectful. Some residents suggested adding quiet hours for evening play. Others recommended replacing worn backboards or installing softer basketball nets to reduce noise. Several offered to volunteer during improvement projects. The discussion had evolved beyond keeping or closing the court. People were building solutions together. As the week drew to a close, I organized every survey response into clear categories: support for reopening, suggested improvements, volunteer interest, constructive concerns. The final document wasn't dramatic. It wasn't designed to embarrass anyone. It simply reflected the voices of neighbors who cared enough to participate. That evening, I walked past the basketball court again. The setting sun painted long bands of orange across the empty asphalt. Leaves drifted slowly across the painted quay, gathering near the locked entrance where children once waited for their turn to play. I reached into my backpack and looked at the growing binder filled with meeting minutes, maintenance records, financial reports, and now something even more valuable: the voices of the community. For the first time since the gate had been locked, I believed we were no longer reacting to one decision. We were preparing for one conversation that everyone deserved to hear. The parking lot was already half full when I arrived at the clubhouse. That alone told me something had changed. Normally, HOA meetings attracted the same small group of familiar faces. A few board members, several longtime homeowners, and anyone with a landscaping concern or architectural request. This evening felt different. Families walked together from every direction. Parents carried folders instead of lawn chairs. Teenagers who usually spent Thursday nights at practice quietly followed behind their mothers and fathers. The basketball court had brought everyone into the same room. I tightened my grip on the binder I had spent the past week assembling. Inside were meeting minutes, maintenance reports, financial summaries, survey results, written comments from homeowners, and every supporting document arranged behind clearly labeled tabs. There were no dramatic headlines, no highlighted accusations, just information presented in the order I had discovered it. As I entered the meeting room, the familiar scent of brewed coffee mixed with the soft hum of quiet conversations. Folding chairs filled quickly until people began standing along the back wall. I recognized dozens of neighbors I had spoken with during the week. Many offered encouraging smiles. No one looked eager for an argument. They looked ready to listen. Patricia Collins sat near the front beside the other board members. Her pastel blazer was as neatly pressed as ever, and the organized folder resting beside her looked almost identical to the one I carried. She greeted residents politely while reviewing several printed pages before the meeting officially began. She appeared calm, professional, completely confident. The board president called the meeting to order, worked through routine agenda items, and eventually reached the final discussion: community recreation area review. The room became noticeably quieter. Patricia stood first. She thanked the board for taking resident concerns seriously and explained that temporary closure allowed time to evaluate long-term solutions. She spoke about maintaining neighborhood standards, minimizing unnecessary disturbances, and protecting shared property. Her presentation remained respectful, measured, and carefully organized. When she finished, no one interrupted. The board president then opened the floor for homeowner comments. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Then I stood. I carried the binder to the podium and placed it gently on the wooden surface. The sound of the metal rings clicking open echoed through the room. I appreciate the work the board has done, I began. I also appreciate every homeowner who has shared their thoughts over the past week. I wasn't interested in debating personalities, so I focused entirely on facts. I summarized the maintenance reports showing the court remained in good condition. I reviewed budget documents demonstrating that upkeep costs were relatively modest. I explained that publicly available meeting records contained only limited discussion regarding the closure. Finally, I introduced the community survey. Hundreds of responses. Families, retirees, residents who used the court regularly, residents who never used it at all. Each response had been recorded exactly as submitted. No edits, no selective quotations. Only the collective voice of the neighborhood. I displayed simple charts summarizing the results. Most homeowners supported reopening the court. Many suggested practical improvements. Dozens volunteered to help maintain it. As I stepped away from the podium, I looked across the room. The atmosphere had changed. People weren't staring at me. They were studying the information, turning pages, comparing numbers, reading comments from neighbors they knew by name. For the first time since the gate had been locked, the conversation no longer centered on assumptions. It centered on evidence. The board president thanked me for the presentation and looked across the audience. "If anyone else would like to speak," he said quietly, "this is your opportunity." What happened next couldn't be planned, rehearsed, or summarized inside any report. One chair moved, then another. Neighbors began standing, one after another, carrying nothing more than their own experiences. And I realized the most important voices that evening had not yet been heard. The first person to stand wasn't someone I expected. It was Mr. Harold Jensen, a retired engineer who had lived in Willow Creek Estates longer than almost anyone else. He slowly walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked around the room before speaking. "I don't play basketball," he said with a gentle smile. "In fact, my knees wouldn't let me if I tried." Soft laughter rippled across the audience. "But every afternoon, I sit on my front porch. I hear the basketballs bouncing. I hear the kids laughing. To me, that's not noise." He paused. "That's what a healthy neighborhood sounds like." When he returned to his seat, several people nodded quietly. Then another resident stood. A young mother carried no notes, only a small photograph in her hand. She held it up toward the board. "This was taken 3 summers ago. Even from where I stood, I could recognize the basketball court in the background." Her 2 children were smiling beside neighbors from 3 different streets. "We moved here because this community felt alive," she said. "The court wasn't just a place to play. It was where my family met people who became our closest friends." She thanked the board for listening and returned to her chair. One by one, more homeowners approached. A high school student described learning teamwork during evening pickup games. A grandfather explained how he spent weekends teaching his grandson to shoot free throws. A couple who never used the court admitted they had completed the survey because they believed shared spaces mattered to everyone, not only those who used them. Each speaker remained respectful. No raised voices. No personal attacks. Only stories. Real experiences from people who called the neighborhood home. As I listened, I noticed Patricia Collins carefully taking notes. She wasn't interrupting. She wasn't arguing. She simply listened. The atmosphere inside the room felt completely different from when the meeting had begun. The basketball court had become something much larger than asphalt, painted lines, and steel hoops. It represented trust, participation, the belief that neighbors deserve to be included in decisions affecting shared spaces. Eventually, the board president thanked the final speaker and looked across the audience. "I appreciate the thoughtful comments we've heard tonight." He turned toward the board members. "Before we discuss next steps, I'd like to ask whether anyone wishes to respond." Patricia adjusted the papers in front of her before standing. "I want to thank everyone who participated respectfully," she began. Her voice remained composed. "It was never my intention to dismiss the importance of the court. My concern has always been balancing different interests within the neighborhood." She glanced briefly toward the survey summary resting on the board table. "It's clear tonight that many residents have shared perspectives I had not fully heard." The room remained completely silent. No applause, no criticism, just attentive listening. The board members spent several minutes reviewing the survey results, maintenance reports, and homeowner comments together. Occasionally, they asked brief questions about participation numbers or document sources, all of which could be answered using publicly available records. Everything was transparent. Nothing depended on speculation. As discussion continued, I looked around the meeting room. The same neighbors who had arrived uncertain now exchanged quiet smiles across the rows of chairs. Parents, retirees, teenagers, and longtime residents sat together without division. Whatever decision the board reached, something important had already happened. The community had rediscovered its own voice. The board president finally closed his folder and looked toward the audience once more. "I believe we've heard enough information to make an informed decision." A hush settled over the room. Every eye turned toward the board table. The vote that would determine the future of the basketball court was only moments away, and for the first time since the gate had been locked, I felt complete confidence that the outcome would reflect not assumptions, but the voices of the people who actually lived here. The board president took a slow breath before speaking. "All those in favor of ending the temporary closure and reopening the basketball court following the recommended maintenance improvements." Hands began to rise. 1, 2, 3, then the 4th. The motion passed by a clear majority. For a heartbeat, the room remained completely still, as though everyone wanted to be certain they had heard correctly. Then a wave of relieved applause filled the clubhouse. It wasn't loud or triumphant. It sounded like people finally letting go of a breath they had been holding for weeks. I looked toward Patricia Collins. She didn't argue with the result. She quietly closed her folder, folded her hands together, and nodded once as the final vote was recorded in the official minutes. The board president raised his hand gently. I'd also like to recommend establishing a volunteer committee to assist with future recreational improvements and increase homeowner participation before major community decisions. This time, every board member voted in favor without hesitation. The applause that followed felt different. It wasn't about the basketball court anymore. It was about rebuilding trust. As residents slowly gathered, their belongings, conversations filled every corner of the room. Neighbors who had barely spoken before introduced themselves. Parents exchanged phone numbers. Several retirees immediately offered to help organize future projects. The atmosphere no longer felt divided. It felt connected. Before I reached the exit, someone tapped my shoulder. It was the father I had met beside the driveway the previous weekend. His son stood next to him, still holding the same orange basketball. "They're reopening it," the boy whispered, almost as if saying it too loudly might somehow change the decision. His father smiled. "Thank you for listening instead of fighting." I shook my head. It wasn't me. I looked around the room. It was everyone. The following Saturday morning, the neighborhood gathered at the court before sunrise. The gate was unlocked for the first time since the closure. Its metal latch clicked open with a simple sound that somehow felt more satisfying than any speech I had heard during the meeting. Volunteers immediately got to work. Pressure washers removed months of dirt from the painted surface. Teenagers scrubbed benches until the faded green metal began shining again. Parents planted fresh flowers around the entrance. Retired neighbors repaired loose fence sections and tightened worn bolts beneath the backboards. Someone brought donuts. Another family delivered coffee. Children, temporarily banned from playing until the cleanup was complete, waited patiently outside the fence, bouncing basketballs along the sidewalk with growing excitement. The steady rhythm echoed through the morning air. Thump, thump, thump. The same sound that had once been described as a disturbance now felt like a promise returning home. I found myself repainting the free throw line alongside Mr. Jensen. We worked quietly for several minutes before he looked at the fresh white stripes stretching across the asphalt. "You know," he said, "I don't think this was ever about a basketball court." I smiled. "I don't think so either." When the final coat of paint dried, the volunteers stepped back almost instinctively. The court looked cleaner than it had in years. More importantly, everyone standing around it felt like they had helped build something together. The locked gate that had once separated neighbors had become an open entrance welcoming them back. As children finally ran onto the court, laughter immediately replaced silence. Basketballs struck the fresh pavement. Sneakers squeaked across bright new lines. Parents gathered beneath the shade trees, talking with people they had only recently met. Watching the neighborhood come back to life, I realized the vote had accomplished far more than reopening one recreational space. It had reminded all of us that communities grow stronger when people participate before decisions are made, not after they are forced to live with them. And hearing those basketballs echo across Willow Creek Estates once again, I knew the sound belonged exactly where it had always been. About 2 weeks after the court reopened, I was finishing an evening walk when I noticed someone standing alone near the entrance. It was Patricia Collins. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the maple trees, painting long shadows across the freshly resurfaced asphalt. Inside the fence, children laughed as basketballs bounced in steady rhythm. Parents sat on newly cleaned benches while neighbors waved to one another as if they had been doing it for years. Patricia wasn't watching the game. She was watching the people. For a moment, I considered continuing my walk. The story had already reached its conclusion, and neither of us owed the other another conversation. Before I could turn away, she noticed me. "Daniel." Her voice was calm. "Do you have a minute?" I walked over and leaned lightly against the outside of the fence. The familiar sound of sneakers squeaking across the court filled the brief silence between us. "I've been meaning to thank you for something," she said. I looked at her, surprised. She smiled faintly. Not for disagreeing with me. She paused before continuing. For making sure the discussion stayed respectful. The words caught me off guard. She looked toward the court again. "When all this started, I honestly believed I was protecting the neighborhood. I know, I answered. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I believe that too. She let out a slow breath. I spent so much time reading reports and thinking about liability that I stopped paying attention to what the court actually meant to people. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Children erupted into cheers after someone made a long three-point shot, and both of us instinctively turned toward the sound. The same noise that had once seemed controversial now blended naturally into the evening. Patricia smiled. I'll admit something. I waited. I hadn't been to the court in years before the meeting. She laughed quietly at herself. I forgot it wasn't just a recreational facility. It's where neighbors become neighbors. I nodded. Exactly. She glanced toward the newly planted flower beds surrounding the entrance. I saw the volunteer sign-up list. More than 60 residents. And the maintenance committee? Already planning seasonal inspections. She shook her head in amazement. I honestly thought reopening the court would create more problems. Instead, it had created more participation. People were attending meetings who had never attended before. Homeowners were volunteering for landscaping projects, holiday events, and maintenance days. The recreation committee had doubled in size. Suggestions now arrived before decisions instead of after them. The entire neighborhood had become more involved. I've learned something, Patricia said quietly. Being responsible isn't just preventing problems. She watched a young boy pass the basketball to another child waiting beneath the hoop. It's making sure everyone has a chance to be part of the solution. I smiled. That's a lesson most communities spend years trying to learn. She extended her hand. No hard feelings. I shook it. No hard feelings. The handshake lasted only a moment, but it carried none of the tension that had defined the previous weeks. Only mutual respect. As we stood there, Mr. Jensen walked past carrying a folding chair for an upcoming neighborhood movie night. He waved at both of us. So, he called with a grin. Are either of you signing up to help paint the picnic tables next Saturday? Patricia laughed first. I guess I just volunteered. I'll bring the brushes, I answered. Mr. Jensen nodded with satisfaction before continuing down the sidewalk. Patricia looked at me and smiled again. I suppose this neighborhood still has plenty of work to do. It always will. But now we'll probably do it together. As she walked toward the clubhouse, I remained beside the fence for another few minutes, listening to the steady rhythm of basketballs echoing beneath the evening sky. The sound no longer reminded me of conflict. It reminded me that understanding rarely begins with proving someone wrong. More often, it begins the moment people finally decide to listen to one another. Several months have passed since that Thursday night inside the clubhouse, but every time I walk through Willow Creek Estates, I still find myself slowing down as I approach the basketball court. Not because I'm looking for problems, because I'm listening. The chain-link fence that once held a bright orange, temporary closure, notice now supports a simple community bulletin board. Children have pinned handmade tournament brackets beside announcements for neighborhood movie nights, volunteer cleanup days, and charity food drives. Someone even painted a small mural near the entrance that reads, "Built Together." Every time I see those words, I smile. They tell the entire story without mentioning a single disagreement. On warm evenings, the familiar soundtrack returns exactly as it always should. Basketballs striking fresh pavement, sneakers squeaking across painted lines, parents clapping from the sidelines, neighbors greeting one another by name. None of those sounds feel ordinary anymore, because I remember what the silence sounded like. I still remember the locked gate, the folded notice, the confused faces of children standing outside the fence with nowhere to play. At the time, I thought I was trying to save a basketball court. Looking back now, I realize I was really trying to protect something much easier to lose. Trust. The changes continued long after the court reopened. Attendance at HOA meetings nearly doubled. Volunteer committees expanded to include residents from every corner of the neighborhood. Major proposals were shared publicly before votes instead of afterward. Community surveys became standard practice whenever projects affected shared spaces. Even small decisions felt different because people understood they had been invited into the conversation. No neighborhood suddenly becomes perfect. Disagreements still happen. Budgets still need balancing. Different opinions still exist. But now those conversations begin with listening instead of assumptions. That single change has made all the difference. One afternoon, while walking home from the mailbox, I noticed the same young boy I had first met holding a basketball in his father's driveway months earlier. He wasn't so young anymore. At least, He carried himself differently. He dribbled confidently toward the court before stopping to wave. "Hey, Mr. Carter." I waved back. "You heading to another game?" He grinned. "Every Tuesday." Then he added something that stayed with me long after he ran off. "We've got enough players now to make 2 full teams." I watched him disappear through the open gate without slowing down. No hesitation. No locked fence waiting for him. Just an open court filled with friends. As evening settled over Willow Creek Estates, I sat on a nearby bench while the sun dipped below the rooftops. Golden light stretched across the painted free throw line we had restored together months earlier. Mr. Jensen read a newspaper beneath a tree. Patricia chatted with several parents about the upcoming fall festival. Volunteers arranged folding tables for another neighborhood event. No one seemed to notice how extraordinary the ordinary had become. Maybe that's the greatest sign of a healthy community. Not dramatic victories. Not unforgettable speeches. Just neighbors working together so naturally that cooperation becomes routine. I often think back to the first afternoon I stood outside the locked basketball court wondering how one decision had happened without so many people knowing. If I learned anything from that experience, it wasn't about HOA rules, meeting procedures, or survey results. It was something much simpler. Communities don't become stronger because everyone agrees. They become stronger because everyone is given the opportunity to be heard. Justice isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with shouting, humiliation, or revenge. Sometimes it arrives quietly, carried by facts, patience, respectful conversations, and neighbors willing to stand beside one another instead of against one another. And every time I hear another basketball echo across that court, I hear something far more meaningful than a game beginning. I hear a neighborhood that remembered its own voice and chose to use it together.